Welcome to Interpreters and Interrupters. I have a very special guest. Jace Norton is the CEO of Q'eqchiʼ Language Services, and we're going to talk about Indigenous language interpreting. Thank you for being a guest on the show.
Hi, thanks for having me, Maritza. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm so excited to speak to you. Let's start with you telling us a little bit about yourself.
My name is Jace, and I'm the CEO founder of Q'eqchiʼ Language Services. I am completely white, just to put that on the record. I'm a non-native Indigenous language interpreter for the Kekchi language. So the kind of backstory of how I got into all of this started when I was 19 years old. I volunteered to serve a mission for my church, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And as part of that process, you submit your application and say you're willing to serve a mission, and then they assign you to somewhere around the world. I was assigned to Guatemala for 2 years. When I got to Guatemala, I was reassigned to learn Q'eqchiʼ. Q'eqchiʼ is an indigenous Mayan language from Guatemala. It's one of 22 Mayan languages from Guatemala, one of 30 total Mayan languages that are still in existence today, that are still actively spoken by millions of people. I was living in villages where nobody speaks Spanish. For the most part, very few people speak Spanish. And because of that, and because as a missionary, my whole job was talking to people, I had to really work hard to learn the language. I put a lot of heart and soul and blood and sweat and tears into learning the Kekchi language. I had no formal training in the language, just on my own and with whatever resources I could find within the community. It was a bit of a grueling process, especially because Mayan languages and a lot of the indigenous languages from the Americas, they're not anything like Spanish. It definitely took a while to start getting the language. I was fortunate to be given a loose tongue that I was able to learn the language. So I finished my mission in Guatemala and really didn't think that I would ever use the Kekchi language again. I thought, unless I go back and visit or something, that it would not really be something in my life in a professional capacity or even a personal capacity. I wanted to learn more languages and went to Brigham Young University, and I ended up deciding to study Arabic and loved it so much that I switched my major to Arabic and Middle Eastern studies. And I wanted to work in embassies and go to different countries, continue learning new languages and learning about new cultures and new people. I was definitely very sad that it didn't work out. In the beginning of 2020, I started doing interpretation for immigration hearings. It blew my mind that there was that much demand. I kind of had assumed that maybe there would be 1 or 2 cases a year. I did not expect that there would be that many migrants here in the United States that spoke the Kekchi language. I was flying all over the place, New York City, San Francisco, Kansas City. I was in Denver a few times, and I was just interpreting just for Kekchi. The pandemic came, shut down all the courts. I was not at all intending to start my own company, but I kind of was propelled into this industry.
One day, I just had this one hearing with only one respondent. I turned to the judge and I said, Your Honor, I don't think the respondent knows Spanish. And we asked the respondent several times, and he finally confessed that he spoke Mon. And I think that he wrote Spanish because he didn't think he could get an interpreter, or maybe didn't even know that the court provided interpreters. Is this one of the situations that you ran into?
This is a relatively common thing. Obviously, we don't want to make any blanket assumptions about why people do things. I think it's really important to remember a lot of the common factors from which these people are coming. The number one thing that is important to remember is that Indigenous people almost universally have faced pretty extreme discrimination, exploitation. They faced marginalization, ridicule, all of these things based on their indigeneity. Their home countries, there is no such thing as real language access. They don't have laws like we have that say that they can't be discriminated against based on their language. And then the last factor would be that Indigenous people, particularly in Latin America, have been basically brainwashed, oppressed so much to consider that their language is not actually a language. Most of the time when people from Latin American countries talk about Indigenous languages, and even here in the United States, it's become very prevalent as well to use the word dialect instead of language. And we can see the potential for this to be actually detrimental. It's not just incorrect, but it's also very harmful because these people now don't think of their languages as a language. They think of them as some kind of subcategory, a dialect. And so then when you say, what language do you speak? It could be that they are not thinking about their language as a language. And so, they will say, well, the only language I speak is Spanish. I don't speak any other language. And in the back of their mind, they may be thinking, I do have my dialect, but I've never received any service because of that. And oh, by the way, anytime that I mention that I am Indigenous, I've been ridiculed, I've experienced persecution, all these different things. It is really, really common for there to be sort of this ambiguity about what's going on. We like to remind people that individuals can have limited proficiency in other more dominant languages. So somebody could be limited Spanish or have limited Spanish proficiency. In addition to having limited English proficiency, that's a concept that we're very familiar with in the industry of interpreting. Many, many different individuals from Indigenous communities have limited Spanish proficiency. So one of the things we're helping to kind of educate our clients and also Spanish language interpreters and other interpreters of other languages is to help recognize when somebody possibly has limited proficiency in that language, and then have sort of the toolkit to ask the right questions to be able to have sort of just a little bit of awareness that will help them open the door so that this person feels comfortable and is also, on the same page. When you say, what's your native language? We need to make sure that we're all on the same page.
How do you deal with the terminology used in immigration court?
Great question. Obviously, Indigenous language is typically based on the cultural sort of context, meaning that they're coming from relatively isolated communities in many cases. So they don't have exposure to court proceedings, even in their own home countries. And to be fair, many of us living in the United States, it's not every day that we go and have to be in a court hearing. So many of us wouldn't understand these terms either. But the difference is that there's really, in most cases for these technical terms in any field, whether it's medical or legal, there's not a direct translation for that term in the Indigenous language. We need to try to place the burden of explanation on the provider, meaning that if they say something for which there's no term in an Indigenous language, as the interpreter, it's kind of our right, but also I would say in many cases our responsibility to kind of throw it back at them and let them know there is no word for this. So, I need you to explain it in its most basic forms, and then I can interpret that explanation.
Well, that right there is an anomaly in legal interpreting, because you're not supposed to advocate for the respondent.
In some ways, you could consider it advocating, but in some ways, you can consider it saying, I literally can't do it. I can't interpret. And technically speaking, you could just use the Spanish borrowed word, right? And that's typically what will happen in many cases. They'll just use the Spanish borrowed word and then call it good. What I'm recommending does line more with advocacy, and obviously is harder to do in situations where people are not as forgiving. In a legal setting, they're not as allowing for that kind of thing. If it's simultaneous interpretation, you don't even have the opportunity. You can't just stop everything and ask them. Realistically, many, if not most, Indigenous interpreters would also agree with this. I don't think that simultaneous is effective interpretation mode for Indigenous languages, especially when you think about the person for whom you're interpreting. That if you're interpreting simultaneously, you're not able to, make sure that everything's clear and understood, that everything's just going to go over their head. If they don't know, and if they don't stop you and ask you, what is that, then it will just go over their head. But I think with Indigenous languages, in many cases, kind of have a little bit of a workaround where we can advocate making sure that the provider is explaining, and we can use the language as sort of the reason for that, right? Because truthfully speaking, there is no word for prosecutorial discretion. I do know what that means because I, have heard it and everything, but as an interpreter, it's not really my job to explain things. Technically speaking, I can't interpret it until they explain what it is. In some cases, I've described what it is because I know what it is. But I think that overall, especially in settings where the other parties are more forgiving, they're more patient. So like in medical settings, I think it's absolutely appropriate to throw it back on the provider, tell them that there's no word for whatever it is that they're wanting to say. And in some cases, maybe they are going to go explain it after, but I can't really pause at this point. If the doctor says you've been diagnosed with leukemia and then they pause and want me to interpret that, I could do it because I know what leukemia is, but I think my preference would be to say, you describe it and I'll interpret the description.
You are absolutely correct when you say that should be on the provider.
The whole purpose of us interpreting is so that that person with limited proficiency in either English or Spanish or another language, so that they can understand, not just so that they can hear everything in their own language. There's also the cultural context that's very important. When we as interpreters, when we know, well, okay, I can say the Spanish term for this and I can just do that, but I know that this person most likely will not understand that. So I do think that in some ways, as Indigenous language interpreters, we kind of have to do a little bit more advocacy because there's more of a cultural gap. I also think that that's something that in common languages or more mainstream languages like Spanish that we should probably be doing more of as well, to ensure that we're not only facilitating being a conduit so that the words are being passed by, but that we're helping marginalized communities to really understand. Because I think, especially with Indigenous languages and people from Indigenous communities, for the most part, they don't want to make a fuss. It's not very common that they would say, well, hold on a minute, I need you to explain all this again because I'm not understanding. It goes back to not wanting to be problematic, having experienced lots of persecution, lots of discrimination. I think that can be part of it, but also as human beings, it's kind of a general thing as well that we like to kind of just nod our heads and go along with things and not cause kind of issues or problems in a lot of ways. As interpreters, we should probably be doing more advocacy. And I think that the industry is adapting to address that a little bit more. Originally, the stress was on you're a conduit and that's all you're supposed to do. And in very exceptional circumstances, you may do some cultural advocacy, but basically try to avoid it is kind of like the sense that you got in some of the earlier trainings. And now organizations like the NCIHC is kind of trying to make it more clear that you are the best person to decide what needs to happen in that situation because you're the bridge, right? So it goes beyond just being a conduit. You're really a bridge. You're making sure that the parties are able to understand one another and facilitate understanding and not just facilitating the literal translations and interpretations. You're making sure that people are able to understand one another and you're accounting for cultural gaps, you're accounting for linguistic gaps, all of those things.
Many people believe that language acquisition, in other words, language learning, is just about learning the language, learning how to pronounce it correctly, learning how to write it, learning how to read it. But there's more than that. There's that cultural component of language learning.
The learning the grammar, pronunciation, the syntax, vocabulary is just really kind of scratching the surface. And the whole reason that we do those things is so that we can learn about the actual culture and learn about the people themselves and why they say the things that they do and how they say the things that they do. When you really have mastered a language, you can understand also the culture behind the language. And that's not always easy to do because culture is not monolithic, even within certain language groups, even within Indigenous groups, right? Culture can vary slightly depending on where they're from, depending on how much education they've had, depending on all these different factors. Learning the language well and then starting to look at the culture and look at the culture on a spectrum and understanding the different areas that some of these people are coming from, you start to get really to the heart of those people.
What areas in the United States are these speakers prevalent? Where are those Mayan speakers located, or are they just dispersed?
You would be shocked to see just how dispersed speakers of Indigenous languages are. Mayan languages are probably one of the most in demand, meaning that there's a lot of them that especially in the last 10, 15 years, there's been a large surge of migration from communities, specifically from Guatemala and Mexico, that speak Mayan languages. But you have a lot of other languages from Mexico that are not Mayan languages, but are still Indigenous languages. They're from the Uto-Aztecan family or the Otomangdayan family. So there's, over 60 different languages. And within those languages, you have hundreds of different variants that are often not mutually intelligible. Then you have South American languages like Quechua, Quichua, Aymara, and even some really, really low diffusion languages like Shua. Or even you could possibly have Indigenous languages from Brazil. It is somewhat less likely that you would encounter South American languages because it's harder for them to get to the United States, right? It's just a longer journey. and there may not be as much demand, or they may be going other places. But there are speakers of indigenous languages, I would venture to say, that in every single state in the United States. Now, there are definitely some pockets where it's more prevalent. Absolutely. Like Oakland, California is completely just full to the brim with speakers of Mam, which is from Guatemala. That has become a hub for speakers of Mam. And so lots of people are, when they come to the United States, that's where they go. Kingston, New York is pretty much 100% full of Q'eqchiʼ people. So they have a very strong Kekchi community in Kingston, New York. Other communities like Q'eqchiʼ in Providence, Rhode Island, or Seymour, Indiana is full of speakers of a language called Q'eqchiʼ. And I know this because I've been to all these places. And as part of my job, especially in the beginning, when we were first getting started, most of our work was through programs that were supporting unaccompanied children. For that work, the government requires that any interpreter working has to have U.S. work authorization. So they can't be living in Guatemala. They have to be here in the United States. They have to have valid U.S. work authorization. My company did, just this last year, somewhere around 14,000 interpretation calls in 2024. 70% of those were for indigenous languages. So the demand is substantial. Every single week we get a new hospital, we get a new court district. I still feel like we've really just started to scratch the surface of just how much demand there is.
Of these Mayan languages, are there some of these that are extremely difficult to find someone that is at least qualified to interpret?
Every time that you put a restriction or a limitation on who can do the interpretation, it makes the pool that much smaller. Q'eqchiʼ would be a great example where, relatively speaking, it's been harder to find US-based interpreters for those languages. And so, it becomes that much more difficult when a client says, I need someone who's US-based. I think the purpose of only allowing US citizens or residents or asylees to be able to interpret, my understanding in large part is because they want money to go to US citizens and not to foreign contractors, which, sure, that makes sense for many different languages like Spanish. It makes sense that, we want the money to stay in the United States. It's almost not feasible to find somebody here in the United States who is a US citizen or a resident or asylee. It's just not feasible because statistically, there's not enough people that meet that criteria to even find them. It's very, very difficult in many cases. Most recently, we have been helping a hospital with a language called Kapingamarangi, which is a Micronesian indigenous language with about 3,000 native speakers. From a financial perspective, it's really not cost effective for them, right? They would say, why were we going to worry about this? It's going to cost us 40 hours worth of labor to get, 2 hours worth of work twice a year. So why are we even worrying about this? When you talk about indigenous language access, that has to happen. Very few courses are available, all these things that are kind of barriers to entry. We are trying to change all of that by investing in our interpreters, developing free trainings for our interpreters in both English and Spanish to really increase the pool of available resources and then elevate the standard, right? Because it's not enough to just find people that speak both languages and call it good. We need to treat these languages just like every other language, where we are increasing, we're always developing, helping interpreters to develop their skills, colonizing groups that have basically marginalized them and not allowed them the same access to resources. So they don't have the same access to literacy in their native languages. So even all of our interpreters, very, very few of them are literate in their native language.
For those listening, what would you advise for them to become an interpreter?
Well, I think sometimes what's holding some interpreters back, in many cases, one of the big things I hear is, I'm comfortable with medical interpreting, but I'm really not comfortable with court interpreting. I see that as kind of an issue currently for indigenous languages, where people are a little too intimidated or they feel they don't have enough training. And so I would just really emphasize that when you're interpreting an indigenous language, there's not that many people that can do it. If you're not doing it, really nobody else will be able to. I think it's just a matter of gaining some confidence, because I definitely was intimidated doing court interpretation, but that's how I started. It is intimidating, but just having the confidence in yourself and in your language skills to not get hung up on words. I think a lot of times we want to say exactly the words that are being said. And I think my message is that what's really important is the message, the meaning. It's less about knowing everything and more about knowing how to navigate through things that you don't know, because you always will run into things that you have no idea how to say, especially when we're talking about abstract concepts that don't really have presence in the culture, the language of the culture for which you're interpreting. You have to really be able to just navigate things and say things different ways and have the confidence to ask the provider, again, throw it back on them and say, can you please describe this in a different way or describe it in a very basic way, and then I can interpret that. Everybody can be an interpreter. Being bilingual by itself doesn't necessarily mean you have all the skills you need. Anybody who's bilingual can be an interpreter. That's not to say that you won't have to do some work, that you won't have to improve yourself, learn new terminology, do a lot of practice, but everybody can. If you speak an Indigenous language and you are thinking about being an interpreter, you can do it. Absolutely. We at Maya Bridge would love to help train you so that you can help members of your community to be able to have language access. Follow us on LinkedIn. Look us up at Maya Bridge Language Services, website at www.mayabridge.org.
Jace Norton, thank you so much for this awesome conversation about Indigenous languages. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me. It's been a great time talking about it.